Well, hello everybody and welcome to our first online lesson about schools. So, this unit is called Schools and Colleges and Organisations. It's got some interesting bits and it's got some slightly less interesting bits and, well, it's for you to judge, but I think you might find that this might fall under the slightly less interesting bits one. So, what we're looking at today is 1.1 and 1.2. 1.1 is identifying the main types of schools, which are state schools, independent schools and colleges. And 1.2 is describe the characteristics of the different types of schools and colleges in relation to their educational opportunities. So by educational opportunities, we're looking at things like the kind of subjects they offer, the kind of facilities they might have. There's a huge range of difference with schools, as you will see. I've run 1.1 and 1.2 together because there's quite a lot of information and it just seemed sensible. So when you see your assessment assignment booklet, I've done it as a grid, so it should be reasonably easy to using the PowerPoint. If you make some notes as we go through, I've numbered the slides. So that you'll see on the bottom of the corner of each slide there's a number, so I will tell you what number I'm on and then we should be good. Okay, so number 1. Okay, so a little picture there of various sorts of schools. The history of education in England has been, it's been very changeable. The way that people decided that education was important has depended on what's been happening socially and politically. For initially, when schools started, they were just for boys because girls were seen to be not needing an education because they were going to be wives and mothers. There was all different types of education, some much more practical than others. The kind of basis of mainstream education we have now, it still kind of follows on very much from almost a Victorian model where you wanted people to sit and listen and do as they were told, because that way you could get the most amount of information into them, and having that kind of obedience was quite useful when you were training people to work in factories and be part of larger organizations. However, it could be argued that these days that's not really a model of education that really suits people. People need to be challenging and entrepreneurial and to question the status quo more, because that's what makes you successful in these times. Similarly, having to learn lots of quotes and being able to remember lots of equations, all that kind of stuff, which is still part of the curriculum. Again, you could argue that that's not the way we live now. Being able to have researching skills and being able to find information is actually more important than being able to hold on to lots of information. Anyway, it's not a perfect system, but we're going to look at it nonetheless. So if you look at slide 3, this just outlines what we're doing. We're going to start with the state system schools, and there's lots of different schools that come under this. So slide 4 will show you that children between the ages of 5 and 16 are entitled to a free school place. Now, most children in this country start school when they're 4, but legally they don't actually have to until they're 5. And there's always a lot of discussion around the August birthdays about whether they can be held back a year. Currently, they are discussing if they can go back to staggering starting schools, that sort of thing, for that group of children, because for some children, they're nearly a whole year younger than the rest of the kids in their class, and that can be just too much of a stretch for some. So most people go to the school that's nearest to where they live, which has a reasonable reputation, and there's a lot of parental choice in school places. I have to say, the last couple of years, people haven't always had their first choice school because there's been a lot more school-aged children looking for places. There's a certain amount of things to be taken into consideration, but most parents really want their child to be somewhere where they're local, where they're going to have local friends. If you're getting a bus to go, for an hour, or having to a long commute each day. It just means that often, your children don't know the people that they live with, and that can make for quite difficult holiday periods, and can make them quite socially isolated. Our next slide, we have got lots and lots of different sorts of schools. There's if you can look in the middle, on the top row, there is a school there which is in London, and which is linked to my daughter's primary school, and they have their only outside space on top of the school because it's in the centre of London. It's in Soho. And so they have got, reasonable like tennis courts and that kind of thing, but all above the school is because there's no outside space at all for children. We had an interesting experience when we did like a school swap, and we had some year 6 children coming from the school in Brixton, and then some kids coming from our village school, which has, got lots of green space and, bits of forest all around. And they were so surprised by each other's situations. It was really, really interesting. Some schools are tiny. There are some schools sort of on the islands around Scotland, where they can have maybe 1, 2 adults and like 3 or 4 children, really, really tiny. Some schools are absolutely massive. There is such a variety of what's on offer. Before we go any further, you ought to maybe have a look at some of these general notes I've made on slide 6. So there's a few terms that you probably be familiar with, but just in case. The national curriculum. So the national curriculum is the subjects and the topics within those subjects that have been decided by the government, through discussion with educators. So it means that if you are doing science in Scotland or science in England or different parts of the country, you will be doing the same curriculum. The difference is that we have different awarding bodies, so different examining bodies who set the exams, and sometimes they might have slightly different emphasis on some of the topics, and there can be a very small variation. So, but on the whole, the things that you will be taught in year 8 in science is going to be pretty similar, with maybe just a few small changes. We've also got the key stages. So when children start at the earliest part of school, we've got what's called the early years foundation stage, which is reception in year 1. After that, then we move into key stage 1, which is everything from 4 till 7. So that's your early part of the school at primary. And then 7 to 11 is your key stage 2. You have your end of key stage 2 SATs, which are your standardized assessment tests. And then when you start at secondary school, you go into key stage 3. And then for the last part of secondary school, when you're doing your GCSE years, so when you're between ages of 14 and 16, that's when you're in key stage 4. Okay, so the local education authority, that is the part of local government that has a responsibility for schools. And it used to be, before academies really took off, that they used to have an awful lot of control over schools, what happened and how they were run. And they would also control the funding. But we'll look at that as we move into academies, because that's no longer the most common common model. They still are very useful in terms of having a sort of a stable of specialists. So there will be people like educational psychologists and occupational therapists. If you have a need in your school, you often, the place you'll contact, it would be the local education authority. They will put you in touch with a specialist in your area, so they kind of keep very up to date with all that kind of information. The other things I wanted to mention is the governors and the academy trusts. So although your head teacher has got overall control day to day of your school, the real power, which sort of surprised me when I first discovered how schools worked, is in the hands of the governors for state community schools, comprehensive schools, but or academy trusts for academies. And academy trusts or governors are a group of professional people. Sometimes they've been teachers themselves or local business people who want to sort of keep active, keep networking, take part in the kind of the meetings and the problem solving and decision making that they did often when they were working. Often these are retired people, but not always. And they have a huge amount of power. So they will liaise with the local education authority. They are the people that appoint head teachers. If there's a big problem in the school, they will be called in. In secondary schools, you can have probably 10 to 12 different governors, and they will have a different area, maybe like a curriculum interest area, which they will be responsible for. There'll be a governor who has responsibility for safeguarding. There will be a governor that has responsibilities for things like the settings, buildings and insurance. There'll be one that helps with sort of staff recruitment, that kind of stuff. There will also be a member of staff that's a governor. If it's a state school, there'll also be a representative from the local education authority there. If it's a faith school, they'll also have a local religious person. And there'll also be a parent governor. So a parent who's currently got a child at the school will be going along to the meetings and sort of help kind of steer how the school's going. So it's quite a responsible job. Oh, and they also have a clerk of governors who gets paid a wage. Everybody else does it on a voluntary basis, which is incredibly generous because it's quite a time consuming thing to do. But the clerk of the governors gets an annual wage and is has to keep everything very secret and confidential, goes along to all the meetings, makes the minutes, that kind of stuff. Okay, so those are our key terms. So moving on, slide 7, community schools. So community schools are a type of state funded schools run by the local education authority. It used to be the most common model of schooling, really. Money from the government came to the local education authority. Then the local education authority gave that money to the schools and had a lot of control about what happened in the schools. It meant that all the terms and the start times and everything were all the same. It meant that staff working there had the same wages and conditions. That was the general model. Educational opportunities, well, what community schools do, which is really useful, is that they are really reaching out into the community. So you can expect to have things like gyms that are used by people outside of the school. The schools can be used as meeting places for adult education sessions, I know sports, cadets, singing groups. They often get used at the weekends. Sporting groups like rugby clubs and stuff will come and use their grounds in the holidays and also at the weekend. So they're always really, really busy. They are kept sort of very much in the heart of the community, which means that it's very easy to get speakers in. There's really tight links with people who went to the school or who have been involved in the school. Things like Christmas fairs and stuff are always very well attended at community schools because you've got those people who feel really attached to it because of how they've used the building themselves. Okay, the next one is a specialist school, not to be confused with special schools in bold type. So these are secondary schools who have applied for specialist status. So if you have a school that performs really well, maybe in, I don't know, maths or science or languages, it used to be that you could apply for extra funding for your school, and the teachers from a specialist school in the area that you were doing particularly well would go and share best practice with other schools. It meant that schools got this extra money, they had the best sort of equipment. Often staff with that sort of interest were attracted into the school, and also parents and children with those kind of interests would see that school more favourably. Sadly, the funding stopped in 2011 for these schools. No, who knows? Who knows why? I don't know why. Okay, special schools, quite different special schools. So special schools are for children who have got extreme special educational needs. Now these can be like physical disabilities, but they can also be social, emotional and mental health disorders. They are strictly by invitation only. If you have a parent who you think and your child would benefit from going to a special school, you can't just sort of invite yourself in. It's very much you are referred, you are invited in, that kind of a thing. There's a school near me, and it used to be a school where it was just mainly children with real emotional difficulties. Then it turned into a bit more of a dyslexia kind of academy, and these days it's just full of very, very anxious children. So the flavour of what's required does change. Special schools have a really high ratio of adults to learners. I mean, in some cases as many as like one-on-one in really extreme cases. Staff will have received special training. There'll be a lot of specialist equipment. There'll be easy access to specialist workers like speech and language therapists, physiotherapists, occupational therapists. Often they will be sort of full-time on the payroll, specialists like that, if it's if the school requires it. You can every now get independent special schools which are not funded by the government, but they are pretty rare. There was one in Romsey called Stanbridge Earls that shut a few years ago, and that was a specialist dyslexia area, and it was an amazing school. Very small classes. I worked there for a while actually. It was incredible. It was like £25,000 to £30,000 a year to send your children there, so it was extraordinarily expensive. That kind of ratio of staff to children, is very, very expensive. So on the whole, special schools, they're very difficult to get into. They're extremely expensive to run. They do an amazing job. Academies and free schools, moving on. So academies can be primary, secondary or special schools. They can be universities, technical colleges or studio schools. So they were introduced in 2000 as a way of raising standards across all the school system. The government really wanted schools that had decent Ofsted results to become academies, and there was quite a good financial incentive for schools to stop being controlled and funded by the local education authority. And instead, what happens with academies is money comes from government straight to the school. So it means that the head teacher has a lot more responsibility. They're responsible for things like upkeep of building and insurance, things that the local education authority used to do. They are also have a bit more freedom in terms of, they could change their term times, they could change the times, they start and finish school. On the whole, they don't. Lots of schools, when they were deciding whether they were going to become academies or not, a lot of the teaching staff were very anxious because it meant that they were no longer protected by local education authority wage rates, and they said that they'd be happy for the school to become academies if they retained the rights and status they had when they were local education authorities. So on the face of it, not an awful lot appears to have changed for the staff working there, but obviously much more responsibility for the governors and for the senior team within the school, who are having to think about drains and stuff that they didn't really have to consider before. Some academies form MATs, which are multi-academy trusts. So if there are schools in a sort of the same county, they can kind of band together. And I know that there are some examples in Southampton with places like Wordsworth Primary and Shirley, and I think there's a cluster called Hamwick of about 5 or 6 schools, and that's really, really handy, because it means that if you're trying to buy, I don't know, photocopying paper for a school, if you join together with like 5 or 6 other schools, you've got a lot more leverage, a lot more purchasing power to get good deals. It means if you've got specialist staff, you can move around, you can share best practice. You can work together to achieve all sorts of things. You can have like competitions and events that run across the different sorts of schools. If there's a problem with the senior team, and heads can sort of step in and advise. So, it can be quite a useful and productive union. Free schools, moving on to the next slide. Free schools are run in a very similar way to academies, with the exception that these are set up by parents, teachers, or sometimes other groups, sometimes religious groups, if they feel that there isn't a school in the area which isn't meeting the children's needs. So they have some flexibility to start from scratch. It's quite a new phenomenon, the free schools, but they're growing all the time. The government are very keen on them. So for both of these schools, in terms of educational opportunities, the head teacher's got more control over finances and the curriculum. And as I say, the cluster situation does work really well in, you know, in terms of even things like marketing schools, advertising schools, you know, that it can be quite powerful. Okay, moving on. We've got faith schools next. So faith schools can be different sorts of schools. They can be free schools, academies, etc. But the thing about them is that they only have to teach the faith that the faith school supports. Similarly, they often will only employ staff which follow that faith, and will only accept children that follow that faith. Some are more strict than others. So there's Fitra Sips in Southampton, which you'll probably be familiar with, and I think that their admissions criteria is pretty strict. The majority of faith schools in this country are Church of England schools, and they're not particularly bothered if people are churchgoers or not. I know there are some Catholic schools, Rosewood, I think, is one locally, and you have to, and if you want your children to go there, then you have to be able to prove that you've been going to church regularly. You need to have a letter from your vicar to say that both the parents are confirmed into the religion, that kind of thing. So it really varies, you know, school to school on how strict they are with that. In terms of educational opportunities, some people feel that it's a disadvantage that children aren't taught like a variety of religions. They think that just teaching one religion, you know, puts them at a disadvantage in terms of appreciating cultural diversity, all the things that we looked at in our EDI unit, really. But saying that, 37% of all primary schools are faith schools, so they're a large number. Often Church of England schools do teach about other religions as well, but that's not to say that they all do. Okay. Forest schools. Now, we looked at forest schools quite a lot when we did our health and safety unit about balanced approach to risk, you may recall. What a great unit that was. So originally from Sweden, forest schools are an initiative which are run through lots of schools. So you will have full-time nurseries that are forest schools, but mainly for secondary schools, they will and primary schools, they will use the forest system by, you know, going out several times a year, different times of the year. Do you remember we looked at the different parts of the season, not waiting for it all to be nice weather? And they give them a really interesting outdoor experience. In terms of the educational opportunities, you may remember we talked about how it really builds confidence, team building, skills, whittling, fire making, really beneficial for lots of children with SEN, particularly those with ADHD. They respond really well to being outside in that way. Okay, the next sort of school we're looking at is middle schools. I confess, I'm not very familiar with this sort of schooling. So it was started in the 1970s, and it thought that the idea behind it was that it would be really beneficial to divide schools into sort of three separate stages for children. So you've got your lower school, which is ages 4 to 9, your middle school 9 to 13, and your upper school 13 to 16. There's only about 133 types of this school still running, but I think there is one in Shirley, so you probably know more about this than I do. There's no specific educational opportunities here, but some people do find that the jump from primary to secondary school can be very daunting, and using a middle school system, you sort of avoid that, so you can provide a bit more pastoral care. So I think that was a strength of it. Okay, grammar schools. So grammar schools come in and out of favour with politicians. They were designed in 1944 because they really wanted to give children from some poor backgrounds an opportunity to do really well in education, to be able to go to university. Famously, Margaret Thatcher, our first female Prime Minister, went to a grammar school. She was a grocer's daughter. She was very bright. She went to a grammar school, she went on to university, and she was really very keen on the system. To get into a grammar school, and there are still a fair amount of them around, you have to sit a very stringent set of exams called the 11+, and children sit these exams when they are in their year 6 of primary school. They're usually held in the grounds of the grammar school, but in some primary schools which are in the catchment area, they will actually be able to sit the exams all together in the primary school. Although they were designed to sort of level out social difference, the nature of the tests means that if you don't receive quite a lot of tutoring to sit these tests, then you don't generally do very well with them. Some of the tests, I mean, you've got your normal maths and your English, but they've got some very unusual kind of abstract mental tests that they do, which is very, very difficult for someone, a bright child, just to sit and be able to pass. So ironically, even though they were supposed to be helping children, from poor backgrounds get into these great schools, you will find that generally people are spending a huge amount of money pumping children from an early age into the tutoring system so that they can have a chance at going to the grammar schools. I mean, there is no doubt the grammar schools get exceptional results. They're usually in the top 5 academic results in the country. They beat independent schools. They're free because they're paid for by the state. You can only apply to go to one if you live a certain amount of miles from the school, which means that house prices can really rocket around grammar schools. Some people are really, really keen on them. What I would say about grammar schools is that they sort of cream that academic level off the top of all the other secondary schools in the area, which I think is a shame. They're fiercely competitive. They can be extremely stressful. They're usually single sex. Not much of a fan of the grammar schools, if I'm to be honest. But anyway, moving on to independent schools. So these are fee-paying schools. So independent schools are paid for by parents, and some can be fairly reasonable. So there's an alternative school model like the Steiner schools, where you would be paying probably about £6,000 per year per child for them to have an independent education. However, you can also send your children to some of the most illustrious schools that the country has, places like Eton and Harrow, where members of the royal family send their children, and you can be looking upwards of about £42,000 per year per child just for the fees. It doesn't include the extraordinary amount of equipment and unusual outfits that these schools will also require you to have. I mean, I've put in some pictures of some of the top hats, the penguin suits, the boaters. They are very traditional, very traditional. I mean, some of the English independent schools are world famous centres of excellence. When you look at people like all the politicians and the members of government, like 80% of them will have come through sort of 2, 3, 4 of these schools, and then on through Oxford and Cambridge University. It's a little group. In terms of their educational opportunities, they can be absolutely extraordinarily good. Really small class sizes, amazing grounds, incredible sporting equipment and facilities. There's a real emphasis on sports at most independent schools, some devoting pretty much all of their afternoons onto outdoor pursuits because of the team building and the exercise and all of that kind of stuff. Lots of schools, will have stables with horses, Olympic-sized swimming pools. There can be some really extraordinary things there. About 6.5% of children go to independent schools, which is quite a lot, I think, in this country. They are not inspected by Ofsted in the way that normal schools are. So there will be a special in-school inspection service that will come in and have a look. They don't have to follow the national curriculum. They have much more freedom with that. They don't have to follow the GCSE exam situation either. And there was a real quite a lot of anger in the press when the new GCSEs were were launched, which were no longer A star being great. 9 was suddenly great. And there's the public school sector said that it was much too confusing, and they didn't think that their children should be forced to be guinea pigs at a system like that. So they stuck to IGCSEs, which are international GCSEs, which have a lot of coursework, which are much more lenient in markings because they don't take into consideration spelling and punctuation in the way that the new, more rigorous GCSEs do. So it meant that children at independent schools were sitting these much easier exams and obviously doing fabulously well. And for the last 3 years, everybody else has been doing these much more rigorous GCSEs, and surprise, not doing as well at all. Before this change, the state sector were really up there with independent schools in terms of academic results. There are some really excellent academic achievements for schools. That must have been George. I should have put a note on the door. Okay, boarding schools. So boarding schools are where students stay overnight. Some boarding schools also have daytime students. Day boys, day girls they're called. There are very few boarding schools actually provided by the state. So often if you are in an army family or forces family, then the state will pay for children to go to a boarding school. But on the whole, they are mainly independent schools. Sometimes there's children only sort of going home at the end of term. They often attract students from overseas as well. So yeah, they're a large sector. International schools. So these are schools around the world originally designed for children of British parents who are working abroad. They initially they would only accept children who are English speaking, but more recently they will accept people from the host country, as it's a great opportunity to learn English. These are not inspected by Ofsted. These are inspected by ISL, which is International Schools Inspectorate. The vast majority are in Asia, fun fact. In terms of the educational opportunities, they provide a sort of a UK or maybe more of a United States style of education. Pupils sit the IGCSE, the International GCSE, like they do in independent schools. Their facilities and class sizes vary massively. There are some really well-to-do ones. There are some less flash ones. Okay, almost there, everyone. British schools overseas. So British schools overseas are schools which behave and look and feel very much like the schools we have here, but they are located all over the world. There's 140 of them. They try and keep the same kind of atmosphere and ethos as a British school. They follow the national curriculum. They sit GCSEs. There are sometimes, they have to take on different policies and procedures and laws because of the host country. That could be things like, rather than having a fire drill or lockdown, they might have like tornado training or earthquake stuff. Who knows? Some variations. Right, finally, so to colleges. So we've got 3 sorts of colleges we're looking at here. Further education colleges, sixth form colleges, and specialist colleges. So further education colleges, and you'll be familiar with the work of Eastleigh College, I believe, provides education from students from 16 all the way through to adults. They offer an enormous range of subjects and courses. Lots of apprenticeships will be doing English and maths and maybe part of their training through further education colleges. There will be full-time vocational colleges for all sorts of things. So vocational are the courses that you do to get to a specific job. So dental nursing, cookery, drama, electricians, plumbing, carpentry, those kinds of courses. They also provide a lot of adult education, as we know, and those can be sort of courses like this. They can be courses like making porcelain flowers. They can run in the evenings, they can run at weekends. Some courses can be short, 5 or 6 weeks, like how to ice your Christmas cake. Some can be work ready qualifications like this, which go on for about 7 or 8 months. So massive variety. Some of these courses, or these colleges, because they offer such a huge range of courses, can have a vast amount of students, and 22,000 students is what I was told that Eastleigh College currently has, with all the apprentices and work release people, the evening courses, the vast amount of adult education. Absolutely massive. Okay, sixth form colleges. These are for students between the ages of 16 and 19. So this is where you go after secondary school. They offer full-time courses, usually the more academic A levels, you know, English, Maths, French, Latin, history, that kind of stuff, but also 2-year BTECs, which are business and technology courses. So these BTECs, if you do them for 2 years, they are the equivalent of sort of three, well, they say 3.5 A levels if you get them to distinction level, and they can be things like health and social care, web design, all sorts of things like that, and they can get you to university as well as the A levels. In fact, some university courses prefer these kind of BTECs and diplomas because, for example, if you're doing art or something creative, you know, it shows that you have really explored a huge range of things for 2 years and you're still keen. So generally, you know, it shows that you've got a real interest there, and you're you know, very likely that you are going to go on to be successful. They also offer opportunities for students to retake maths and English if they didn't do as well as they thought. Okay, the last sort of college is a specialist college. There's not a huge amount of these. They are often residential, and they are for students who have special educational needs again. So again, you know, huge ratio of adults to students, specialist equipment, specialist staff. All I wanted to say for my final slide about the educational opportunities of all colleges is that because there is such a wide range of courses, often, you know, it's the first time that young people ever actually get to make a decision about where they're going to go. School is a system that is sort of done to you, and then you get to 16 and you suddenly have to think about what you want to do and where you want your future to go, and it can be so overwhelming. Some people obviously know from an early age they want to be a doctor or a vet or a fireman, and they're kind of on that path. But for the vast majority of students, they feel really overwhelmingly lost by it. Luckily, there's really good support from the colleges themselves that they might be going to, and in most secondary schools as well. Lots of opportunities for children to go and have a look and see what's available. But it can be a really difficult transition, I have to say, school to college, because you have to really start thinking about who you actually are, and that's quite scary, isn't it? Okay, so there is an extraordinarily long PowerPoint about schools and their opportunities. I hope you found it fascinating. That's all I have to say on the subject for now. See you next time.